was native to the place. They were of the place, and they were rooted in this land. And they lived right along these shores. They were nomadic, so they would wander inland during the winter, and they would wander to the coast in summer, together with their cattle and their sheep and their livestock. And in those days, the beach used to go right up to what is today Strand Street. That's why it's called Strand Street, Beach Street. And it was actually only during the 18th century that the Dutch began to undertake the work to excavate the beach. What's now called Woodstock, for instance, was also underwater. So that whole area was underwater. And it was along those streets that you would find the Khoisan living. So when you think about the early history of Cape Town, well, one famous historian, Nigel Worden, has said that you're not going to understand the history of the Cape if you don't understand the history of slavery. And particularly when you walk around Cape Town, I mean, at the top of Strand Street there used to be a quarry, and in this quarry the slaves would excavate the stones, and with that stone they built huge parts of Cape Town that is still there today. Places like the castle, places like the Slave Lodge. And in fact, many of the wine farms, if you go out into the rural Western Cape, was built by slaves. I think Nigel Worden's right in that slavery lasted here for 250 years. That's almost the biggest chunk of colonial history that we have. Nothing else has been so fundamental in our history.
Looking at the origin of the slaves, and we must ask the region, why did they bring slaves to the Cape? When the Dutch came here, it was never their intention to enslave the local indigenous tribes like the Khoi and San. It was policy of the Dutch. It was only under the British where they used the Khoi as indentured laborers. The reason for bringing in slaves, first and foremost, the colony was expanding. They needed labor. So the first batch of slaves that came here, 1658, they were actually captured on a Portuguese boat, the Amersfoort. And those slaves were from Angola, the west coast. Most of the slaves at the Cape came from the East, Southeast Asia. Let's start with India. Some statistics indicate that 50% of the slaves came from Bengal, the Malabar coast, Pondicherry, you name it. And then from all the areas where the Dutch had trading outposts. They came from Madagascar because there was a slave station there established by the Dutch. They came from Mozambique. Most of the slaves came from those areas. And if we look at the slaves, the categories of slaves at the Cape, you first have the slaves in the lodge. All the company slaves, they were housed in the lodge, the slave lodge.
Islam is one of the many faiths that came to Cape Town. The statutes of India in the 1600s indicated that no other religion should be practiced besides the Dutch Reformed Church and so forth. And if you're caught spreading other religions and so forth, you will be, you can even be hung, caught and tortured and so forth. These were very, very serious things. So people brought here, resisting the Dutch in the East Indies, Batavia, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka and so forth. Some even came from the coast of Africa. They were brought here and they were suppressed. Very importantly to know that they were suppressed, tortured, not to believe. So you have a situation where people that normally do things customary, for them normal things, personal hygiene, cleanliness and so forth, was not allowed. So Islam came here through various ways. The first was the Mardekas, the people that came here. Later on there was also what we call the Orang Kayang, men of influence and power. So we'll see that sometimes with the Kramats or the Awliya that are buried and so forth, men of influence and power, people who resisted the Dutch, political prisoners, and then also the slaves, the people from the localities. Some of them were very well-known people in the islands. They came from a royalty, but they were nameless, stateless, and they were faceless when they came here. Stripped of their identity, stripped of their name, given a name. If you came here, for example, and you landed here, the Dutch word is Galant, you would be given the name Galant. If you came during September, you would be called September, van Boogies, and those type of things. So people stripped of their name, their culture, and also of their language, so they couldn't speak to one another. So you looked really like a slave. You looked like an animal, really, being treated and told what to do.